Single dad found a homeless woman behind a dumpster. He asked, "Where's the food I bought you?" Daniel Carter was a single father who had learned to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. 3 years earlier, his wife had passed away after a long illness, leaving him alone to raise their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Life had changed overnight. Daniel worked as a mechanic during the day at a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, and most evenings he delivered food just to make sure there was always enough money for rent, school supplies, and the little things that kept Lily smiling. Despite the exhaustion that came with working 2 jobs, Daniel never let his daughter feel the hardship. To Lily, her father was simply the strongest and kindest man in the world. Every night after his final delivery, Daniel would stop at a small convenience store to buy Lily a snack before heading home. The store sat beside a narrow alley where a large, rusted dumpster leaned against a cracked brick wall. It was not a place most people looked at twice. People passed by quickly, avoiding the smell and the shadows. But one evening Lily noticed something Daniel had overlooked for weeks. "Daddy," she said softly from the passenger seat, pointing toward the alley. "Why does that lady sit there every day?" Daniel glanced toward the dumpster and saw the woman again. She was wrapped in an old coat that had clearly seen many winters. Her hair was tangled, and her face looked pale and tired. She sat quietly on a piece of cardboard, her back against the wall, staring down at the ground. What struck Daniel the most was that she never called out to people or asked for money like others sometimes did. She simply sat there as if trying not to be seen. Daniel hesitated before answering his daughter. "Sometimes people fall on hard times," he said gently. "And they don't always have anyone to help them." Lily looked thoughtful for a moment, her small brow wrinkling with concern. "Is she hungry?" Daniel didn't know the answer, but the question alone made him feel uneasy. "I'm not sure," he admitted. Lily turned toward him with hopeful eyes. "Can we buy her food?" Daniel felt a quiet warmth in his chest. Even after everything they had been through, Lily's heart was still full of kindness. He nodded and walked into the store, returning a few minutes later with a warm meal, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. Together they walked toward the alley. The woman looked up as they approached, clearly surprised. Daniel held out the bag to her. "Here," he said kindly. "You should eat something." For a moment she simply stared at the food, as if unsure it was real. Then her tired eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel smiled politely and turned to leave with Lily, believing it was just a small act of kindness on an ordinary night. But he had no idea that this simple gesture would soon lead to a question that would reveal a story far deeper than he ever imagined. The next evening Daniel finished his last delivery just as the sky began turning dark. The cold air of the evening crept through the streets as he drove toward the same convenience store where he and Lily stopped every night. Lily sat in the passenger seat swinging her small legs, humming quietly to herself. But Daniel noticed that every few seconds she glanced toward the alley beside the store. "You're thinking about that lady again, aren't you?" Daniel asked with a small smile. Lily nodded. "Did she eat the food we gave her?" Daniel honestly didn't know. He hoped she had, but something about the woman's quiet expression the night before stayed in his mind. It wasn't the look of someone begging for help. It was the look of someone who had grown used to surviving alone. They walked into the convenience store and Daniel bought another warm meal along with 2 sandwiches and a bottle of water. Lily carefully held the bag as they walked outside together. The alley looked just as dark and quiet as the night before. The large rusty dumpster stood beside the cracked wall, and the woman was sitting in the same place, wrapped tightly in her worn coat. The wind blew lightly through the alley, lifting pieces of paper and dust across the ground. When she saw Daniel and Lily approaching, she seemed surprised again. Daniel handed her the bag of food. "Good evening," he said kindly. She took the bag slowly, nodding in gratitude. "Thank you again." Lily gave her a small smile. For a moment Daniel was about to turn and leave like the night before. But something caught his attention. The ground around the woman was empty. There was no sign of the food container he had given her yesterday. Not even the bottle. It made him curious. He hesitated for a moment before asking gently, "Excuse me, can I ask you something? The woman looked up nervously. Of course. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. The food I brought you yesterday, where did it go? For a second the woman didn't answer. Her eyes dropped toward the ground and her fingers tightened slightly around the bag. Daniel quickly added, I'm not upset or anything. I was just wondering. A long moment passed before she finally spoke in a quiet voice. I gave it away. Daniel blinked in surprise. You gave it away? She nodded slowly. There are 2 children who sleep behind the abandoned building down the street, she explained softly. Their mother hasn't come back in days. Daniel felt a sudden chill in his chest. You mean, you didn't eat it? The woman shook her head gently. They were hungrier than I was. For a moment Daniel didn't know what to say. He stood there staring at the woman in disbelief. She was homeless herself, sitting behind a dumpster in the cold, yet she had given away the only food she had. Lily looked up at her father with wide eyes. Daddy, there are kids sleeping outside? Daniel slowly nodded, still trying to process what he had just heard. The woman looked embarrassed, as if she had done something wrong. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to waste what you gave me. Daniel quickly shook his head. No, he said firmly. You didn't waste it. In fact, he realized something important in that moment. Sometimes the people who have the least are the ones willing to give the most. And suddenly Daniel knew the story wasn't over yet. The next evening Daniel could not stop thinking about what the homeless woman had told him. The image of 2 children sleeping alone in an abandoned building stayed in his mind all night. As he worked at the auto shop that day, tightening bolts and fixing engines, his thoughts kept drifting back to that dark alley and the quiet woman who had given away the only food she had. When evening came, Daniel picked up Lily from school and drove toward the convenience store again. But this time he came earlier than usual. On the passenger seat beside him were several bags filled with food, sandwiches, fruit, and bottles of water. Lily looked at the bags and smiled. Are these for the kids? Daniel nodded. Yes. If they're really out there alone, we should help them. They parked near the store and walked toward the alley. The wind was colder that evening, and the sky was turning gray as the sun began to disappear behind the buildings. The homeless woman was sitting in the same place behind the dumpster, hugging her coat tightly around her shoulders. When she saw Daniel and Lily again, she looked surprised. Daniel greeted her kindly and placed the bags beside her. I brought some extra food today. Her eyes widened when she saw how much there was. This is too much, she said softly. Daniel shook his head. It's not too much if people are hungry. He hesitated for a moment before asking, Can you show us where those kids are? The woman looked uncertain at first, as if she wasn't sure whether she should reveal their hiding place. But after a few seconds she slowly stood up. All right, she said quietly. Follow me. She led Daniel and Lily down the street to an old abandoned building that stood several blocks away. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the building was dark and cold. Daniel stepped carefully across the dusty floor as the woman walked ahead of them. In the far corner of the room, he saw 2 small figures curled together beneath thin blankets. They were children. A little boy, maybe 8 years old, and a younger girl who looked no older than 5. When they noticed the woman, their tired faces suddenly lit up. Miss Clara, the boy said as he quickly stood up. Daniel froze for a moment, surprised by the way they greeted her. You know them? He asked. The woman nodded gently. My name is Clara, she explained quietly. I've been checking on them every night. Lily stepped forward and offered one of the food bags to the children. Their eyes widened when they saw the food inside. As they began eating hungrily, Daniel turned back toward Clara. How did you find them? He asked. Clara sighed softly and leaned against the wall. I used to be a nurse at the city hospital, she said. Daniel blinked in shock. A nurse? Clara nodded slowly. Yes. But after my husband died, the medical bills took everything we had. I lost my house, and eventually my job too. Daniel looked at her with a new sense of respect. Even after losing everything, she had still been watching over 2 abandoned children, giving them the only food she received. At that moment, Daniel realized something. The woman sitting behind the dumpster wasn't just a homeless stranger. She was someone who had once spent her life helping others. And somehow, she was still doing it. That night, Daniel drove home with a heavy heart. The image of the 2 small children sitting on the cold floor of that abandoned building would not leave his mind. As he tucked Lily into bed later that evening, she looked up at him with worried eyes. "Daddy, those kids don't have a home, do they?" Daniel sat beside her and gently brushed her hair back. "No," he said softly. "But we're going to try to help them." The next morning, Daniel made several phone calls before going to work. He contacted a local shelter and spoke with a social worker, explaining everything he had seen. He knew the children needed proper help, a safe place to sleep, and people who could protect them. The social worker promised to come investigate the situation that same day. But Daniel felt that helping the children alone wasn't enough. His thoughts kept returning to Clara, the quiet woman who had been sleeping behind a dumpster while still caring for 2 abandoned kids. That evening, Daniel returned to the alley again, but this time he didn't come with just food. He came with a decision. Clara was sitting in her usual place, wrapped in her worn coat as the cold wind moved through the narrow alley. When she saw Daniel approaching, she looked surprised but gave him a small smile. "Good evening," she said. Daniel handed her a warm cup of coffee and sat down on a nearby wooden crate. "I spoke to a social worker today," he told her gently. "They're going to help those kids." Clara's eyes filled with relief. "That's good," she whispered. "They deserve a chance at a normal life." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet sounds of the city echoed faintly in the distance. Then Daniel finally said something that surprised even himself. "You shouldn't be sleeping out here anymore." Clara looked confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. "My house isn't big," he said. "But there's a spare room." Clara stared at him in shock, unable to speak. You would let me stay with you?" she asked slowly. Daniel nodded. "You protected those kids when nobody else did," he said. "Anyone with that kind of heart deserves help too." Just then Lily stepped forward and gently took Clara's hand. "You can live with us," she said with a warm smile. Tears filled Clara's eyes. For years she had been invisible to the world, another forgotten face on the street. Now, for the first time in a long time, someone was offering her something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. Over the next few weeks, the social workers found relatives who were able to safely take in the 2 children. They finally had a warm home and people who could care for them. Meanwhile, Clara slowly began rebuilding her life. Daniel helped her apply for jobs again, and with her experience as a nurse, she soon found work at a small local clinic. One evening they all sat together at the dinner table in Daniel's modest home. Lily laughed as she told stories about school while Clara listened with a soft smile. Daniel looked around the room quietly. All of this had started with one small act of kindness, and one simple question. "Where's the food I bought you?" Sometimes the smallest moments can change lives forever. And in this case, that moment had created something none of them expected, a new beginning and a new kind of family.